Hello students! It's so nice to be able to meet you, so to speak, over this video platform. I was so honored when your teacher emailed me and told me that I was featured as Composer of the Month in your class. I think that's pretty cool that you guys are learning about composers, because I don't think I started learning about composers until like middle school or high school, so that's pretty awesome. I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in San Bernardino, California, which for your reference is about, I think, 7 or 8 hours south of San Francisco if you're driving. And it's maybe, I think, an hour or so if you take a plane. I started learning music in the 4th grade in orchestra. I picked up the violin, which many of you are probably familiar with. And I continued participating in orchestra in school all the way through the end of high school and into college, where I studied music for a degree. I later picked up the viola in high school, so I actually know 2 instruments, even though viola is my main instrument now. What's the difference between those 2 instruments, you might ask? Well, the violin is kind of like a soprano voice. If you think about it, the notes are very, very high up. I'll go ahead and play that for you. So those are the 4 strings of the violin, and I can add more notes by using my fingers to get those. The viola is a bit lower. It's a larger instrument. I'll hold the 2 of them up together. I don't know if you can see that very well. And so, does a larger instrument have a higher or lower sound? Can you guess? It's going to be lower, right? So here are the strings of the viola. Okay, it's just a tiny bit lower. Some of the notes are actually the same. Okay, so I started the violin in 4th grade. I picked up the viola later in high school. But I actually started composing when I was in middle school or so. My very first time composing was in the 5th grade, maybe towards the end of the year. We had one assignment where my music teacher just allowed us to write a few lines of notes. And that was pretty fun, but I didn't really start thinking about composing all that much at the time. But in middle school, we had these projects that we did every year where our orchestra class would actually team up with the art class, and we would form little groups. And what our project was we had to create an art piece together as a small group, and then we had to come up with a piece of music to go with that, and we would present that to the class. So once I started doing that, I started writing a lot of music on my own, mostly violin duets to play with my friends. And I continued writing music all the way through high school, asking teachers for help here and there. Most of it was, still violin duets for friends, or a string trio, or a quartet for, 3 or 4 instruments. But by the time I got to college, I decided that I wanted to major in music, major in composing. And so that was my main focus, even though I continued to take lessons on viola and I continued to play in the orchestra. And I still do that. I would say the hardest parts about composing, and I couldn't narrow it down to one, so I picked 2 for this. The hardest parts are actually some of the funnest challenges too. I think the biggest one is, taking a few ideas that are in my head and developing it and stretching it out to the point where it's a longer piece, right? Because I might think of a little tune in my head, but maybe that's about 10 seconds or so, right? And oh my gosh, I have to stretch this piece into something that's 5 minutes long, which is a whole lot longer than 10 seconds if you do the math. And even more so if there's multiple parts, like let's say I'm writing for a string quartet, right? That's 2 violins, a viola, and a cello, which is an even lower voice in the orchestra family. I have to figure out all those different layers and how they go together. When all of those different notes are played on top of each other, we call that harmony. I'll show you just a few sketches. This is actually a piece that I wrote and finished last night. This is for a solo clarinet piece. This is the very, very first thing. All these little scribbles and ideas, they probably don't look much like music to you at this point, right? But at the end, this is what it looks like. There are notes, and they're printed on a page, a lot, more similar to what you would see if you were to buy a piece of music at the store. So getting from point A to B is kind of tricky sometimes. It's maybe a bit like, if your teacher gives you a writing assignment and you have to write several sentences. Sometimes you know how to get started, but you're not quite sure how to get to the end. That's kind of what it feels like. I would say the other fun challenge, if you will, about composing is when I get hired to write music, I often have to write music for instruments that I don't know how to play. So for example, I just showed you that I wrote a piece for clarinet. If you gave me a clarinet to play right now, it would sound pretty bad. But as composers, one of our jobs is to understand how those instruments work so that, when we talk to the performers that are playing them, we can sort of, we can understand the music, understand their instrument well enough to write music that will work for them. So I actually, for example, that clarinet piece I wrote for a guy named Derek Burmel, and he's going to be performing that piece on video in a few weeks. And maybe I can send that to you guys as well once that link is out. But we actually met online over Zoom. I think you guys are meeting on that platform as well. We met online to talk about some different techniques for the clarinet so we could, figure out what might work in the piece. So that's another challenge, figuring out instruments that I don't play, okay? The best part about being a composer is, I would say, getting to meet lots of people and getting to work with them and collaborate. I do like that sort of teamwork and getting ideas from other people in very unique ways too. I also get to, not only do I get to kind of figure out their instruments, but if I'm writing for a specific person, I can also learn more about what they like to play and write a piece that fits some of their favorite things to do. So that's probably the funnest part about being a composer. One of the other cool parts about being a composer and a professional musician in general is that I get introduced to a lot of cool music from all sorts of different styles and for all different kinds of instruments. Some of you asked me what's my favorite piece, and that's such a tricky question. I have favorite pieces that I like to play or favorite pieces that I want to play, whether that's an orchestra or as a violist or in a chamber group or a small group of musicians. And then there's, the music that I just love to listen to. Sometimes I have it on, repeat even, and I like to listen to it over and over again. So, since that was a tricky question, I decided to narrow it down just a little bit. This is probably a piece that's, kind of on repeat, in my car wherever I listen to music. And it also fits on like my wish list of pieces I'd like to play someday. And that is a piece called Theatric Number 8. It's by a composer by the name of Casey Cangelesi. And the cool part about that piece is it's written for two performers. One performer, her name is Molly Gabrian. Oops. Yeah, she plays viola. And she collaborates with a guy named Danny Holt. And the interesting thing about him is he plays piano and percussion at the same time. So that piece is found on an album called Trios for Two. And again, the name of that piece is Theatric Number 8. So yeah, I wish I could get a hold of that piece someday and perform it. I'll put a link down in the description so you guys could listen to it. I think you'll have a lot of fun listening to that one. Well, I hope that gives you a bit more insight about myself And I'm curious to hear a bit more about you guys too. Do you create? Do you draw or paint? Or do you play an instrument or sing? Maybe you dance, or maybe you like to create by building different Lego buildings and cool stuff like that. And if so, tell me what inspires you to create. And like I said, that could be anything you can imagine. It can be art, it could be Legos. Maybe you like to write or read, things like that. So tell me about it. Maybe you can send me an email or put it in the comments. Have a nice day.